Part 1. The Call of Destiny. Elena stood alone at the edge of the golden cliffs of Etherholm, watching the 3 moons rise above the distant mountains. She was an elf woman of extraordinary beauty and strength, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders like moonlight made real. Her emerald green eyes held centuries of wisdom, even though she had only lived for 320 years. The wind carried the scent of pine and ancient magic as it swept across the high places where only the bravest creatures dared to venture. Behind her, 3 dragons slept in their stone cave carved into the mountainside. Ember was the first to stir, lifting her crimson head and releasing a plume of warm smoke. The dragon was smaller than her siblings but possessed a fierce spirit that burned hotter than any flame. Her scales caught the light of the moons and transformed into dancing patterns of ruby and gold. Stormwind emerged next, her massive form moving with the grace of a dancer despite her tremendous size. Her scales were pale blue like winter ice, and her ancient eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 storms. Finally came Ashcrest, the youngest of the 3, his midnight black scales decorated with silver markings that shimmered like starlight. Elena turned to greet them, and each dragon approached to touch her hand with their warm snouts. This was the daily ritual they had performed for 5 years, ever since the High Council of the Elves had chosen Elena as a Warbride and given her these 3 dragons as her eternal companions. The dragons were not servants or pets, but equals bound to her by ancient magic and stronger bonds of loyalty and love. The sound of horns echoed across the mountains, a signal that travelers were approaching from the lower valleys. Elena knew what this meant. The human delegation had finally arrived. For months, messages had traveled back and forth between the elven realm and the human world of Terra. The 2 civilizations were dying, poisoned by a mysterious rift that had opened between their dimensions. The worlds were slowly fading away, their magic and technology both failing as the rift consumed their energy. The only solution, according to the oldest prophecies, was a joining of the 2 worlds through a marriage of alliance. Elena had been selected for this dangerous task. As a warbride, she possessed abilities that most elves could only dream of. She could speak human languages, understand their technology, and most importantly, she could use magic in ways that might complement human science. The 3 dragons had been granted to her as proof of the Council's trust and as protection for the journey ahead. She looked down at the winding path that led from the mountains to the valley below. She could see the strange metal machines of the humans moving slowly up the road, carrying people and equipment. Her heart beat faster. This was the moment that would change everything. Elena had read all the scrolls about humans. She had studied their history and their ways. But nothing could truly prepare her for actually meeting them face to face. The dragon sensed her nervousness and gathered close. Ashcrest nuzzled her shoulder while Ember released a soft chirp that sounded almost like reassurance. Stormwind simply stood beside her, the weight of her presence grounding Elena to the moment. These 3 had been her only true companions for so long. They understood her in ways that other elves never could. They accepted her strength without fear and her occasional doubts without judgment. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elena made her way down the mountain path. The dragons flew above her, their wings catching the light as they performed aerial patterns. They were showing off, she realized with a small smile. They too were nervous about what was to come. When she reached the midpoint between the mountains and the valley, she stood and waited. The first humans she saw up close were soldiers, tall and strong in their protective gear. They moved with careful precision, aware that they were entering a land of magic and mystery. Behind them came support teams carrying strange devices and medical supplies. But it was the final figure that made Elena stop breathing. The woman who emerged from the lead vehicle was different from the others. She stood with the confidence of someone used to command. Her dark brown skin seemed to glow in the sunlight, and her close-cropped black hair was adorned with silver lines that suggested rank and achievement. Her eyes were golden and sharp, missing nothing as they scanned the landscape and then fell upon Elena herself. This was Dr. Victoria Ross, Elena knew from the files that had been sent ahead. She was a scientist and diplomat, chosen by the human government to work alongside Elena in the mission to save both worlds. She was also, according to the reports, a person of remarkable skill and unshakable courage. When Victoria saw Elena standing on the path, she stopped walking. The other humans halted as well, waiting for their leader to make the next move. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other across the distance that separated them. It was not a long distance in terms of measurement, but it felt like a vast gulf between two different species, two different worlds. Then Elena took a step forward, and Victoria took a step forward as well. They walked toward each other slowly, deliberately, like dancers who had rehearsed this moment in their dreams. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, Elena raised her hand in the ancient elven greeting. Victoria smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. It was not the polite smile of diplomacy or protocol. It was a real smile that reached her eyes and spoke of genuine warmth and understanding. Elena felt something shift in the air around them, as though the world itself had taken notice of this moment. Before Elena could speak, Ember swooped down from the sky and landed directly between the two women. The dragon spread her crimson wings wide, and most of the human soldiers stepped back in fear. But Victoria did not move. She stepped forward instead and placed her hand directly on Ember's scaled neck. The dragon rumbled, a sound like distant thunder rolling across mountains. For a moment, Elena held her breath, wondering if the dragon would reject this human touch. But then Ember bent her great head and pressed it gently against Victoria's shoulder. And Elena knew that everything had just changed forever. Part 5. The Joining of Worlds. 3 weeks after Victoria's recovery, the High Council of the Elves convened to discuss the future. The intelligence gathered during their expedition to the Rift had been analyzed by both Elena and Victoria working together. What they had learned was both terrifying and illuminating. The shadow creatures were not sentient beings trying to invade, but rather manifestations of the Rift itself, physical expressions of the dimensional wound's corruption. The only way to truly stop them was to heal the Rift at its source. The prophecies had spoken of a ritual that required the cooperation of both human and elf, working in perfect harmony. The ritual required a joining of magic and science, of ancient power and modern understanding. It required the kind of trust and connection that only two beings who had proven themselves willing to die for each other could achieve. Elena and Victoria began their preparations immediately. They worked with the most powerful mages and scientists from both worlds to develop a detailed plan for the healing ritual. The process would require them to enter the Rift itself, to the very heart of the dimensional wound, and use a combination of elven magic and human technology to seal it from the inside. The risks were enormous. Many who attempted such a ritual never returned. Some were consumed by the corruption of the Rift, others were simply lost in the dimensional spaces between worlds. But Elena and Victoria did not hesitate. They had seen what the shadow creatures could do, and they understood that if the Rift was not healed, both worlds would eventually be consumed entirely. The night before the ritual, they stood together on the highest tower of the palace, watching the three dragons perform their evening flight patterns. The dragons seemed to sense the significance of the coming day. They flew with unusual grace and precision, their movements almost dance-like in their beauty. Victoria spoke first, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. She told Elena that she had spent her entire life working toward the goal of saving her world. She had sacrificed personal happiness and connections to focus on that mission, but now, standing here with Elena, she realized that the mission meant far less than the person standing beside her. She said that if she died in the Rift, she would do so, knowing that she had found something worth dying for. She would do so having loved and been loved in return. Elena took Victoria's hand and pressed it against her chest, over her heart. She told the human woman that the prophecies had spoken not just of a joining of worlds, but of a joining of souls. The ancient text said that when two beings from different realms loved each other truly and completely, their connection became a channel for power greater than anything that either could access alone. Elena said that she had spent 300 years as a warrior and leader, serving her people faithfully, but she had never known what it meant to truly live until Victoria had entered her world. They stood together as the moons rose and the stars appeared in the sky. The three dragons descended and landed on the tower around them, their massive forms somehow making the two women feel safer rather than more threatened. Ember pressed her head against Elena's shoulder. Stormwind stretched out beside Victoria. Ashcrest curled around them both, his tail creating a protective circle. As dawn broke, the final preparations were completed. A circle was drawn using both human technology and elven magic. a boundary that would protect everyone else while Elena and Victoria performed the ritual. The three dragons took their positions at equidistant points around the circle, their combined power forming a secondary barrier that would help anchor the two women if they began to lose themselves in the dimensional chaos. Elena and Victoria stood in the center of the circle, holding hands. Around them, hundreds of elves and humans stood in united purpose. Their combined will focused on supporting the ritual. Silira stepped forward with a crystalline vessel containing water from the ancient springs of Aetherholm. She poured it over their joined hands, blessing their work with the power of elven tradition. Then a human scientist named Dr. James Keats activated the technological components of the ritual, machines that began to glow with energy, creating harmonic frequencies that resonated with the natural magic being channeled through Elena and Victoria. As the ritual began, the air itself seemed to tear open. A pathway to the rift became visible, a spiraling tunnel of light and shadow that led to the dimensional wound at the edge of both worlds. Elena and Victoria walked forward together into that tunnel, their hands never separating, their focus absolute. Inside the rift, they encountered horrors and wonders in equal measure. They saw the architecture of reality itself, the fundamental structures that held dimensions in their proper place. They saw the shadow creatures not as monsters but as manifestations of pain, the physical embodiment of the rift's agony, and they understood that to heal it, they would need to do more than seal it. They would need to mend its fundamental nature. Elena channeled the accumulated power of 300 years of elven life, combining it with the magical knowledge of her entire culture. Victoria drew on human ingenuity and scientific understanding, using technology to amplify and direct the raw magical power. Together they wove a pattern of harmony and connection, slowly beginning to bind the tear in reality. The shadow creatures sensed what was happening and moved to stop them. But as the creatures approached, Elena and Victoria's combined power created a barrier that the manifestations could not cross. The barrier was made of light and science, of ancient magic and modern technology, and it was more powerful than any single form of energy alone could have been. Slowly, gradually, the rift began to close. The dimensional wound, which had been bleeding away the life force of both worlds for so long, began to seal. As it did, something unexpected happened. The two worlds did not simply separate. They began to merge, to become a single unified reality where both human and elf could walk freely, where technology and magic could coexist and enhance one another. When Elena and Victoria emerged from the rift, they were changed. Their connection had become visible, threads of light binding them together at fundamental levels of existence. They could feel each other's thoughts, sense each other's emotions, share in each other's abilities in ways that had never been possible before. They collapsed together as the ritual ended, exhaustion and relief overwhelming them simultaneously. The three dragons rushed to their side, releasing cries of joy and celebration that echoed across the mountains. The crowds of elves and humans that had gathered erupted in cheers, understanding that the healing had succeeded. As Elena slowly opened her eyes, she saw Victoria's face above her, outlined by morning sunlight. Victoria smiled, and it was the same genuine smile that had first struck Elena's heart. But now there was something more in that smile, something that spoke of shared experience, of trials overcome together, of a future that stretched ahead filled with endless possibilities. When the human smiled, the Warbride swore her loyalty not to kingdoms or governments, not to prophecies or ancient mandates. She swore her loyalty to the woman before her and to the future they would build together in a world healed and whole. She swore that loyalty with her heart, her mind, and her soul, understanding that some bonds transcended all boundaries and would endure for eternity. The three dragons sang their joy into the new world, their voices carrying across the mountains and valleys, announcing to all that a new age had begun, an age where two peoples had learned to work together, where love had triumphed over fear, and where the healing power of connection had proven stronger than any weapon or force. When the humans smiled, the Warbride swore loyalty, and that loyalty would shape worlds. Part 4. The Sacrifice. The shadow creature's limb was already in motion when Victoria's body slid between it and the ground where Elena lay gasping. The impact hit Victoria across her ribs and threw her sideways with bone-breaking force. She felt ribs crack, felt the air leave her lungs, and knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment of her death. Her vision began to darken at the edges as pain flooded through her body. But death did not come. Instead, Ember erupted from the side in a blaze of crimson and gold, her claws raking across the shadow creature with fury that shook the earth. The creature released an otherworldly shriek that hurt to hear, a sound of rage and pain that seemed to come from outside of normal space. It turned its attention to the dragon, and for a moment, the massive being seemed uncertain, as though it had not expected resistance from something so powerful. Stormwind and Ashcrest joined the battle, their forms moving with coordinated precision that spoke of centuries of fighting as a unit. The three dragons circled the shadow creature, attacking from multiple angles and forcing it back toward the rift. The elven warriors used the opportunity to gather Victoria and Elena, carrying the injured women away from the immediate danger. Elena was conscious but barely, her eyes open but unseeing. Blood ran from a wound on her forehead, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Victoria's situation was worse. She had taken the full force of a blow meant to be lethal, and her body was shutting down from the damage. The head warrior, an ancient elf named Darius with silver braids in his long black hair, made a quick decision. They could not stay and continue the battle. The priority had to be getting the two women back to the palace where proper healing could be administered. He signaled the dragons, and they began a tactical retreat, their superior flight allowing them to distance themselves from the shadow creatures that could only move across the ground. The journey back to the palace was a nightmare blur of pain and determination. Victoria remained conscious through sheer willpower, refusing to surrender to the darkness that pulled at her mind. She wanted to look at Elena, to confirm that the elf woman was still alive, but she could not move her head. She could barely breathe. Each second was an eternity of agony. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness. Her healing abilities, natural to all elves but enhanced many times over in someone of her power, began to slowly mend the damage to her body, but it was a slow process, far too slow to be of any help in an emergency. She remained vulnerable and weak throughout the flight. When they finally reached the palace, the entire structure seemed to explode with activity. Healers rushed forward, their hands glowing with magical energy as they began to assess the damage. Victoria was rushed into the healing chamber, a room at the heart of the palace where the most powerful magic was concentrated. Elena followed moments later, placed on a bed of woven crystal and vines. The head healer, an ancient woman named Solaris who had been healing the sick for over 2,000 years, immediately began working on Victoria. The human woman's injuries were complex, requiring knowledge of human anatomy combined with an understanding of how elven magic interacted with human physiology. Solaris had never encountered a human in such desperate condition before, but she did not hesitate. She simply began the work that had to be done. For 3 days, no one knew if Victoria would survive. Her human body, so fragile compared to elven strength, seemed to be slowly shutting down despite all the healing magic being directed at it. Her vital signs fluctuated wildly. Solaris kept her in a state of magical suspension, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, as the healer worked to repair the internal damage. Elena remained in the chamber next to Victoria, and as her own healing progressed, her concern for the human woman grew stronger. She would have gotten out of her bed and walked to Victoria's side if Solaris had not firmly restricted her movement. The elf woman had to settle for watching, waiting, and praying to the ancient powers that had guided her people for millennia. On the morning of the 4th day, Victoria's eyes opened. For a moment, she simply stared at the crystal ceiling of the healing chamber, trying to remember what had happened. Then everything came back, and her first thought was a question. Was Elena alive? As if summoned by that thought, Elena appeared beside Victoria's bed. The elf woman's face was pale, and she moved slowly, still recovering from her own wounds. But her eyes were bright with relief and something else, something deeper and more powerful than relief. When Elena reached down and took Victoria's hand, the human woman understood that they had crossed some threshold together, moved into a new phase of their connection that could not be undone. Victoria tried to speak, but her voice was broken and raw. Elena placed a finger gently on Victoria's lips and simply sat beside the bed, holding the human woman's hand throughout the night. The 3 dragons, who had been waiting in the courtyard outside the healing chamber, moved closer to the windows, their enormous forms pressing against the crystal as if trying to be near their friends. Solaris moved quietly through the chamber, checking on her patient's progress. She saw the way Elena looked at Victoria when she thought no one was watching. She saw the way Victoria's breathing steadied whenever Elena was near. The ancient healer had witnessed many things in her 2,000 years of healing, but she had never seen a bond like this, a connection that transcended the boundaries of species and seemed to draw power from something beyond the normal understanding of magic and science. 5 days after the attack, Victoria was strong enough to sit up. 7 days after, she could walk with assistance. 2 weeks after the shadow creature had nearly killed her, she stood in the courtyard with Elena and the 3 dragons, her body still aching, but her spirit unbroken. The close call with death had changed something fundamental in both women. They no longer had to speak about their feelings or worry about protocol or propriety. Everyone in the palace could see that they belonged to each other, in ways that had nothing to do with politics or prophecy, and everything to do with the choices they had made to risk everything for one another. Solaris approached them as they stood together in the evening light, the ancient healer's eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement or satisfaction. She told them that their connection had actually aided the healing process. The bond between them was so strong that it had influenced the flow of magic, helping Victoria's human body accept the elven healing power in ways that should have been impossible. She suggested that such connections were rare and precious, and that they should not be taken lightly. Elena and Victoria exchanged glances, and then Victoria smiled. It was the same genuine smile that had first touched Elena's heart all those weeks ago. Elena reached over and took Victoria's hand, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. This was simply the truth of who they were to each other. Part 3, Shadow and Flame, the next morning brought news that sent fear through the palace. More stations had gone silent. The shadow creatures were becoming bolder, venturing further from the rift and attacking with increasing frequency. The elven military assembled at the great courtyard, warriors in ancient armor bearing weapons of crystal and magic. Victoria watched from the palace walls, understanding that what she was witnessing was an older form of warfare, one that had not been used in the elven realm for centuries. Elena appeared on the wall beside Victoria, now dressed in battle garments of deep blue and silver. Her hair was bound back with a golden clasp, and she carried a sword that had been passed down through generations of warbrides. She looked both fierce and sad, knowing that the ancient ways of her people were being called upon again. Victoria studied the elf woman's face and saw the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She wanted to say something that would ease that burden, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, she simply stood close, their shoulders almost touching, offering whatever comfort her presence could provide. The decision was made to send a team to the rift itself to gather more information about the shadow creatures and to assess the condition of the dimensional barrier. Elena insisted on going, and Victoria refused to be left behind. The War Council protested, but Elena invoked the right of a warbride to make her own choices regarding mission parameters. Her authority was ancient and absolute, and eventually the council yielded. The 3 dragons would accompany them, along with a small unit of the most skilled elven warriors. The journey would take 2 days of hard riding and flying to reach the location where the rift tore through reality. As they made their preparations, Ashcrest became increasingly nervous, pacing back and forth and releasing anxious chirps. Ember seemed calm but watchful, while Stormwind simply observed everything with her wise ancient eyes. Victoria loaded her equipment into specialized containers that could withstand dragon flight. She brought sensors and recording devices, her portable computer, and weapons that used energy rather than traditional blades. The human equipment looked strange and stark compared to the organic beauty of elven technology, but Victoria knew its value would become apparent quickly. As they departed the palace, the people lined the streets to watch. They cheered for Elena and the dragons, but their eyes betrayed their fear. Everyone knew that some who ventured to the rift did not return. The shadow creatures were not like normal enemies. They did not obey conventional rules of combat. They seemed to exist partially outside of normal reality, making them difficult to harm with ordinary weapons. The first day of travel was relatively peaceful. They flew high above the mountains, the dragons moving swiftly through the thin air. Victoria sat securely on Stormwind's back, her arms wrapped around the ancient dragon's neck. She had discovered that flying was both terrifying and exhilarating, and the ancient dragon seemed to enjoy the human woman's nervous excitement. Stormwind would occasionally perform gentle spirals through the clouds, As if playing with her passenger, Elena flew with Ember. The smaller dragon somehow perfectly matched to the elf's weight and flying style. They moved in formation with Ashcrest, who carried several of the elven warriors on his back. The young dragon was thrilled to have important riders and performed his best to fly smoothly and majestically. They camped that first night in a hidden valley surrounded by tall forests. A magical perimeter was established to keep the shadow creatures at bay, though all of them understood that such protections were only temporary and could be breached if the creatures attacked in sufficient numbers. The elven warriors took watch shifts while Elena and Victoria worked by firelight, reviewing the data and planning for what they might find at the rift. As the fire burned low, Victoria found herself unable to sleep. She stepped away from the camp and walked to the edge of the valley where a high cliff overlooked vast stretches of uninhabited wilderness. Elena appeared beside her, having noticed her absence. They stood together in the darkness, watching the stars rotate slowly across the sky. Victoria spoke about her fears. She admitted that she did not know if she was strong enough for what lay ahead, if her human body and mind could endure what might be required of them. She spoke of Earth and the millions of people depending on this mission's success. She talked about the weight of that responsibility, how it sometimes felt like she could barely breathe beneath its pressure. Elena listened without interrupting. When Victoria finally fell silent, the elf woman took her hand and squeezed it firmly. She told Victoria that strength was not the absence of fear. Strength was the choice to move forward despite being afraid. She told Victoria that Earth's people had chosen well in selecting her, because Victoria's courage was not the reckless fearlessness of an invulnerable being, but rather the deep determination of someone who understood loss and fought on anyway. The second day of travel brought them finally to the rift. As they approached, the air grew cold and unnaturally still. The earth itself seemed to shudder, and the sky took on a sickly greenish hue that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The rift appeared as an enormous tear in the very fabric of reality, edges glowing with sickly phosphorescent light. Through it, glimpses of another world were barely visible, a mirror realm that was even more decayed and broken than it should have been. Around the rift, the ground was scorched and barren. No plants grew, no animals ventured near. It was a place of absolute desolation, and moving across that dead landscape were shapes that hurt to perceive. Shadow creatures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, their forms constantly shifting and reforming. One of the shadow creatures noticed their arrival and moved toward them with unnatural speed. The elven warriors immediately moved to intercept, their crystal weapons glowing with power. The dragon landed and took position, ready to defend against the assault. But the creature was faster than anyone expected. It surged through the warriors like darkness through water, and Elena found herself face to face with the thing. Its form was vaguely humanoid but twisted, with multiple limbs that seemed to phase in and out of reality. It reached for the elf woman and she raised her sword, but she was too slow. The creature's shadow limb struck Elena across the chest, and she flew backward, slamming against the ground with force that knocked the air from her lungs. Victoria screamed Elena's name and ran toward the fallen elf woman, even as the shadow creature turned its attention to the human. She knew she would not reach Elena in time. She knew the creature would strike her down just as it had struck the Warbride. But she ran anyway because that was what love demanded. Part 2, The Bond, begins. The first few days were filled with ceremony and formal introductions. Victoria and her team were escorted to the Grand Palace of the Elves, a structure carved from living stone and crystal that seemed to grow directly from the mountainside. The halls were lit by glowing stones that had absorbed sunlight for thousands of years. The air smelled of ancient wood and magic, a scent that Victoria found both beautiful and slightly overwhelming. Elena showed Victoria to her chambers, rooms that had been specially prepared for the human delegation. The beds were adjusted to human height, and cooling systems had been installed using elven technology to maintain a comfortable temperature. Everything had been thought through carefully, and Victoria appreciated the effort. She unpacked her equipment and technology, setting up a small laboratory in one corner of the main room. On the second day, Elena found Victoria studying the dimensional rift data that had been collected by human satellites before the journey began. The human woman was so absorbed in her work that she did not notice Elena's approach. The elf stood in the doorway and simply observed, trying to understand the way this woman's mind worked. Victoria's fingers moved quickly across the screens, pulling up new data and making notes with practiced efficiency. When Victoria finally noticed Elena, she jumped slightly but then laughed, a warm sound that echoed through the stone chamber. She gestured for Elena to come closer and showed her the images on the screen. The rift appeared as a tear in reality itself, with energies flowing both directions in ways that seemed chaotic and dangerous. Victoria explained what she had discovered so far. The rift was not stable, she said, but actually growing larger with each passing day. Both worlds were losing power at an accelerated rate. They had perhaps 6 months before the situation became critical. After that, there would not be enough energy left in either world to power the healing ritual that the prophecies spoke of. Elena listened carefully, her sharp mind grasping the concepts quickly. She brought out the old scrolls that had been kept in the elven libraries for centuries, texts that described similar crises from the ancient past. The two women sat together and began to compare the human scientific data with the elven magical knowledge. It was during these hours that a real partnership began to form between them. 3 days after arriving, Victoria asked to meet the dragons properly. Elena led her to the great cave where Ember, Stormwind, and Ashcrest lived. The cave was enormous, with high ceilings and a floor that had been worn smooth by centuries of dragon footsteps. A crystal pool at the center of the cave reflected the light from the entrance, creating patterns that danced across the walls like living things. Stormwind was the first to approach. The ancient dragon lowered her massive head, and Victoria could see the intelligence in those pale blue eyes. Without hesitation, Victoria reached out and touched the dragon's snout. Stormwind made a low trilling sound, almost like a purr but deeper and more resonant. Ashcrest, the playful young dragon, came next. He was more curious than the others, sniffing Victoria from head to foot and then attempting to climb into her lap before Elena gently reminded him of his own enormous size. Victoria laughed again, a sound that seemed to delight the young dragon so much that he performed an awkward spin that sent him tumbling across the cave floor. Ember was more formal in her greeting, but her affection for Victoria was clear. The small crimson dragon positioned herself close to the human woman and remained there, occasionally releasing small puffs of warm smoke that smelled of cinnamon and fire. As the days turned into weeks, Victoria's role in the palace expanded. The human delegation began working with the elves on a detailed plan to address the rift. Victoria contributed her scientific knowledge of dimensional physics, while the elves provided magical theories that had been developed over thousands of years. The two approaches seemed impossibly different at first, but gradually a synthesis began to emerge. Elena spent most of her time with Victoria during this period. They worked together in laboratories carved from crystal, performed tests in the high places above the clouds, and spent long hours discussing theories and possibilities. Victoria's quick mind fascinated Elena. The human woman could solve problems in unique ways, approaching challenges from angles that elves would never naturally consider. One evening, as the two women sat watching the stars from a balcony overlooking the valley, Victoria shared her story. She told Elena about Earth, about growing up in a crowded city surrounded by millions of other humans. She described the human struggle to survive in a world with limited resources and so many mouths to feed. She explained how humans had learned to rely on technology and science because they did not possess natural magic like the elves. Elena listened with deep attention. She realized that Victoria's determination and courage came from a lifetime of fighting against difficult odds. Humans had no ancient magic, no long lifespans, no natural connection to the earth and sky like elves did. Yet they had created wonders and overcome tremendous challenges through pure will and ingenuity. When Victoria finished speaking, Elena placed her hand over Victoria's, and the human woman did not pull away. They sat together in silence as the moons rose and the stars multiplied in the dark sky. The three dragons flew overhead, performing complex aerial patterns that seemed to celebrate the connection forming between the two women. On the 50th day after Victoria's arrival, the first crisis came. One of the power stations that monitored the rift suddenly stopped transmitting data. A team was sent to investigate, but they found only chaos. Shadow creatures had emerged from the rift, beings of pure darkness and malice that seemed to feed on the dimensional wound itself. They had attacked the station and killed the operators before vanishing back through the rift. Elena and Victoria convened an emergency meeting with the War Council. The situation was worse than they had feared. The rift was not just expanding but actually thinning in places, creating tiers where these shadow creatures could slip through. The time they had hoped for, 6 months of preparation, was now shrinking rapidly. They had perhaps only a few weeks before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Victoria reached across the table and gripped Elena's hand. The human woman's eyes were fierce with determination. She said one word that seemed to say everything, just a single name, Elena, but it carried with it a promise and a commitment that transcended species and culture. Elena squeezed Victoria's hand in return, and in that moment they both knew that they were no longer just colleagues or allies. They were bound to each other by something far deeper and more powerful than any prophecy or government decree.